Welcome aboard the starship Red May. Our mission for the next month is to navigate through the ruins of capitalism and seek out new forms of life, to discover lost planets of communism, and to visit new ones in construction, to boldly go where others have gone before and to complete their work. I call it the final frontier, except we at Red May do not believe in frontiers. Enough with the frontier. Let's get right to this panel here. It's called Policing the City, and it's moderated by my friend and neighbor on extended Capitol Hill in Seattle, Dan Berger. Dan is the Associate Professor of Comparative Ethnic Studies at the University of Washington in Bothell. His research emphasizes critical race theory, social movements, and American history, with a special focus on incarceration policy and the prison. He's interested in bottoms-up explorations of identity, politics, activism, and the state. His work focuses especially on U.S. social movements from World War II to the present. He's the author of Captive Nation, Black Prison Organizing in the Civil Rights Era, Rethinking the American Prison Movement, co-authored with Toussaint Louvier, Outlaws of America, The Weather Underground and the Politics of Solidarity, and The Hidden 70s, Histories of Radicalism. Dan, welcome again to Red May.
Thanks so much, Philip. I appreciate it. And very excited for the panel that we have today. So I'm just going to read my little script. Good afternoon, happy Mother's Day, and welcome to Policing the City. We have the good fortune to be in conversation with three amazing authors of new, very exciting, hot off the presses books about race, sex, state violence, and resistance that focus particularly on movement-generated knowledge about the carceral state. The summer of 2020 was not the first time that masses of Americans have taken to the streets in protest of racist state violence by the police. And the still unfolding effort by elites to misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize political opposition through bolstering police power is not new either. Police power has been the vanguard form of social control, upholding and accelerating urban inequality by preying on the most marginalized members of the working class by race, but also by sex and gender. Each of the speakers today has written a book that sheds new light on how these dynamics played out in the 20th century and into the present. So I'm going to introduce each of our three speakers really briefly, and then I have a series of questions that I'm going to sort of open for all of them to discuss and hopefully to talk and deepen each other's comments as well. And then we'll have time for your questions and comments as well. So today we're joined by Anne Gray Fischer, who's an assistant professor of history at the University of Texas at Dallas and the author of The Streets Belong to Us, Sex, Race, and Police Power from Segregation to Gentrification, which was published by the UNC Press, University of North Carolina Press, and is a stunning history of sexual policing. Donna Murch is associate professor of history at Rikers University and author of Assata Taught Me, State Violence, Racial Capitalism, and the Movement for Black Lives, published by Haymarket Books, and an amazing collection of essays about Black radicalism and domestic wars on crime, drugs, and gangs. Jarrod Shanahan is assistant professor of criminal justice at Governor State University and the author of Captives, How Rikers Island Took New York City Hostage, which was just published by Verso, and is a riveting history of rebellion and revanchism in New York City's infamous jail system. Together, these books offer profound, usable histories on the forms, functions, and oppositions to sexual and racial capitalism and state violence. And I am going to stop talking and then turn it over to them. So each of your books, as I said, looks at the ways that police and the larger criminal legal system are imbricated in the sexual and racial hierarchies of American capitalism, particularly in urban areas. So I want to start off just by hearing a little bit from each of you about how you define police power and its relationship to sexual and racial capitalism. Annie, let's start with you.
Sure. Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me all right? I'm thrilled to be here. Happy Mother's Day and happy Red May. I how I define police power, right, is a foundational form of enforcing social order, right, or social disorder. In my book, I talk specifically about the ways that definitions of social order are bound up with colonization, racial capitalism, and heteropatriarchal social and political formations. And this might be getting us away from where you wanted to take this question, but I've been thinking a lot about how important it is, right, for the state to regulate gender and sexual autonomy, to repress gender and sexual autonomy, particularly in light of the leaked Dobbs ruling written by Justice Alito. On page 32 of that ruling, Alito talks about his imagined worst case scenario for gender and sexual autonomy. And he names specifically prostitution, and illicit drug use, right? And it was no surprise to me, right, that prostitution would be imagined in the same legal space as the power of the state to regulate and repress reproductive autonomy. And that's because, right, these forms of social order or social disorder, right, are bound up with this heteropatriarchal formation, right, which is itself defined through whiteness, right, defined through white supremacy, right. The definitions of what constitutes good social order. In my history, I talk in particular about the ways that is defined through constituent of the patriarchal white supremacist home, heterosexual reproduction, right, and the ways in which purity itself is defined through whiteness in explicit contrast to an imagined and degraded form of Blackness, right? So for me, the police power, right, and to police, right, and to repress and regulate and control gendered and sexualized life is really at the core of how law enforcement justifies itself and enforces specific racist and sexist spatial formations, as well as political formations. So that's just what I'll offer to kick things off.
Thank you so much, Dan, for putting together this panel. And I'm just thrilled to be here with these two other authors who've written really exciting books that I'm looking forward to reading. I'd say in my collection, I talk about police power a lot in terms of how it affected Black radicalism and Black radical mobilization. So both thinking about it as a response to mobilization and then in turn how it's also a catalyst for it. So I think I'm interested in how policing also functions as forms of governance and why it is that we essentially end up with a system of what we have begun to call the carceral state, which is really an analytic frame that can be applied to different time periods in history. But why does it end up being municipal, county, state, and federal? So the ways in which policing, especially in the last 50 years, although I think as we go back and we revisit earlier periods in American history and imperial history, I think that it will broaden our understandings of what's been called mass incarceration, because certainly disproportionate targeted incarceration has been going on since even before the United States was constituted as a nation. But I'm interested in the ways that law enforcement has become a mode of governance. And also, as Max Felker-Cantor has shown us in his amazing book, Policing Los Angeles, the ways in which the police also fight and operate in many ways as a political force. So in my collection of essays, for example, I talk about the role of police in response to the urban rebellions of the 1960s and 1970s, thinking about the dialogue between what goes on with the Rockefeller drug laws versus what goes on in the 1980s, where policing and a particular violent vision of policing becomes really divisive among Black communities who on the one hand are responding to a public health crisis when only repressive policing, state violence are offered as options to deal with a public health crisis. So I would say that policing isn't limited to the ways that we usually think about it as being the the legitimate means of violence of the state, but that unfortunately in the United States, it has become implicated and a part of all different forms of governance, including governance of things that we don't normally associate with it, like child welfare, cash assistance, Medicare, Medicaid, that we get essentially the insertion of ideas of police power and surveillance, not only into the carceral aspects of the state, but also into what we used to think of as social welfare.
Thanks. And there's already a lot of really interesting material to talk about. In slight contrast, Captives, in particular, considers police power in a fairly narrow, kind of traditional sense, in terms of, namely, how uniformed police and corrections departments constitute coherent social actors with very particular interests that often puts them in antagonism with other organs of the government and agencies of the ruling class. And I contrast this approach in discussing what's wrong with the punishment system, right, which is something that I do a lot in a criminal justice department. I contrast this approach with the idea that police agencies are simply an agglomeration of individual people who can be affected in terms of their relative biases, lack of empathy, subject position, education, cultural knowledge, so on and so forth. I really encourage the reader to consider police and correction departments as organized political forces with very particular interests. And I trace in Captives the growth of the organized law and order movement in New York City, specifically around their very powerful municipal unions, which, you know, in the 21st century, unfortunately, are some of the most powerful unions in the United States. And of course, this wasn't always the case. You know, up until the 1950s in New York City, municipal unions did not have any legal rights to claim representation. And so in a very short amount of time, police and corrections unions in New York City were able to gain considerable power as a representative force, as bargaining agents, and as powerful political actors in their own right. And I spend a lot of time in the book kind of telling this story. The short version of it that I'll present very quickly is it enabled an almost acrobatic appeal to two distinct fragments of the ruling class. The first would be what we would call the petty bourgeoisie, small, land-bound, kind of parochial interests who are interested in maintaining strong nuclear families, control over women's bodies, traditional white power on the local level, right? And this is often in New York is associated with kind of the outer borough whites. And these are the communities that the police often come from. On the other hand, the police and the corrections unions in New York City were very effective in courting the support of transnational capital, which the big bourgeoisie, the real ruling class, the people who don't really care about borders or boundaries or customs or traditions or just about anything that can't be immediately monetized. And drawing on the scholarship of Rebecca Hill in particular, and also Ruth Wilson Gilmore, I discuss how the police and the corrections unions were able to step into the crisis, the fiscal crisis in New York City in the mid-1970s, and cast themselves in the eyes of the big bourgeoisie as the city agencies that would effectively manage social crisis amid the withdrawal of public services that we now call neoliberalism. And so that's just a little taste of kind of how I have situated the question, and it revolves around taking very seriously the bigger and broader definitions of policing, but also attempting to identify the particular political class interests of the people with the badges who wear the uniforms.
Great, thank you all. I wanted to follow up on the kind of the history piece of it, right? Because Donna, you mentioned that we can find racist and disproportionate incarceration prior to the formation of the United States as a country, right? In the kind of early days of the sort of settler colonies. And Jarrod, you talked about how the dramatic and rapid transformations after 1950 in terms of the power of police unions in New York. So I wanted to just ask each of you to sort of press a little bit deeper on the history side of things in terms of, right, policing has always been this kind of defense of the prevailing order, and yet we've seen these kind of dramatic expansions throughout the 20th century and into the present. So how do you see, and how do your books kind of talk about the expansion of police power alongside changes to urban political economies in this time period? And Donna, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, thank you for that, Dan. Well, I was thinking about that because I live in Philadelphia and I teach at Rutgers, and of course, Philadelphia is home to Eastern State Penitentiary. And then looking at quantitative research talking about in the 17th century having this disproportionate incarceration, especially of women who were migrants from the South, migrating up to Philadelphia and other parts of the Northeast. So that's what I was referencing. I think that when we think about the origins of police power, I think of two different streams. So one is the history of slave patrols in the South, in the American South, that were essentially the deputization often of private forces in order to protect the system of slavery. And you also had other carceral institutions like public whipping posts. So thinking about also the fugitive slave laws, I think the kinds of control of Black populations, whether it be by vigilante militia forms or by state-sponsored police patrols. And I think the other piece is about just the history of settler colonialism in the United States. So the way that Kelly Lytle Hernandez talks about a direct line from Indian caging and seeing the kind of control over indigenous populations and the other forms of detention and concentration as contributing to policing. I'm a late 20th century historian, and so one of the things that I'm struck by is this transition that happens in the 1970s, where simply the numbers of people being incarcerated begins to grow. So it's clear that there are many other precedents and a history of continuity of racialized incarceration in the United States. Of course, convict leasing, following the overturning of Reconstruction, redemption as a system that was responsible for greater numbers of people dying than by lynching. So this is not a new phenomena, but I do think that there is a period in the 70s where the numbers of people being incarcerated really begins to grow. And with that enormous growth is also a qualitative change. So that's the period that most historians and social scientists would talk about as mass incarceration. I think that there are multiple forces that are driving it. It is significant that mass incarceration begins to take place in the decade after the winning of really the expansion of American democracy. And of course, I have this on my mind, given the Supreme Court opinion that Anne referenced earlier, that it's with the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act that the United States really does not complete its idea of liberal democracy until the mid-1960s, when you have the federal government stepping in and protecting the rights of all people to vote, African Americans in particular, and using court rulings and enforcement powers. So within a decade of that, with this protection of new kinds of federal rights, we're seeing a vast expansion of the numbers of people being incarcerated. And in many ways, incarceration becomes a form of, as people have called it, civil death, that it becomes a justification for the stripping of rights. So that could be the stripping of voting rights, the stripping of economic rights. So it's coinciding with a period after the successes of the civil rights movement, the traditional civil rights movement, as well as a broader fight around economics and justice housing, education, and jobs that really takes place in the late 60s and going on through the 1970s. So I think that is important background. It's also striking that it takes place at a time in many ways when we begin to see a retreat from what people have talked about as the New Deal order. So it's with the 1960s that much of the civil rights movement or the long Black freedom struggle is about making sure that all groups of people have access to the American welfare state. So it's in the 1970s, after this is won, that we begin to see a retreat from the welfare state. So use of increasing surveillance and prosecution of people for welfare fraud, the cutting of monies to American cities, which really takes off into the Reagan period in the 1980s. So this period that has been referred to as mass incarceration, it emerges both at a time when we've seen new kinds of rights and protections being won for African Americans, and also at a time where there's a retreat from economic rights. And I think we're all thinking about this week in particular, because with the new majority that we have on the Supreme Court, deep breath, right-wing majority, not only are we in danger of a decision that will strip Roe versus Wade, but I think likely other forms and other rights and privileges that have been won. So I think an important piece when we're thinking about mass incarceration is how recent American liberal democracy is, how recent it is that we actually have full rights to vote for African Americans and other groups, that it's really been only 50 plus years. So I think it's in that lens that I would talk about it, a broader lens that's about both politics and social rights. I'll stop there.
Yeah, Jarrod, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with much of what you've laid out in terms of the periodization, Donna. In particular, in Captives, and then in some other projects, including with my colleague Tyler Wall, I've looked pretty closely at the activist origins of the law and order movement and of contemporary police power. And I think you're exactly right that much of the organized movement of police originated in very explicit opposition to the gains of the Warren Court, the so-called procedural revolution, and then the civil rights movement. So much so that, coming away from doing this research, I now consider the movement of law and order that, famously culminated in Richard Nixon's presidential platform to be a rank and file movement that emanated from the local level in police departments across the country. And police actually, who were faced with the federal intervention of not only the Supreme Court, but also the executive branch pushing integration and pushing the enforcement of formal equality in the mid-1960s, were able to make remarkable common cause across the country, specifically with the old guard white power structure in the American South, the petty bourgeoisie, who did not want integration imposed by the federal government, and also urban police departments in cities like New York and Chicago did not want civilian oversight. They did not want any of the new civil liberties that had been afforded by the Warren Court and were now being enforced by the federal government. Actually, Tyler Wall and I published recently a study of this campaign that was in many ways the precursor to Blue Lives Matter, called the Campaign to Support Your Local Police, which you all probably know a little bit about. It was organized at the national level by the John Birch Society. Yes, I'll post a link in the chat. it was so the Support Your Local Police was organized at the national level by the John Birch Society, but it was very much a federation of local campaigns against the kind of twin specter of what they considered to be an activist federal government pushing liberalism, and also the organized left. And because it was the John Birch Society, they had a theory that it was that all of these actors were working together and it was being coordinated by Moscow, which I have not uncovered very much evidence in support of in the archives. But it provided a very interesting framework for cops across the country to push against these fundamental changes to how they were able to do their job and what they were able to get away with. And this was really the basis of an enduring political coalition between and to me, the more I learned about this, the more I was able to understand how someone like Donald Trump could come along, a real estate tycoon from New York City, and suddenly be speaking the language of the provincial petty bourgeoisie across the country. It's a part of a long political lineage that goes back to this backlash from the 1960s. And the last thing that I'll say, and I already introduced this in my first response, was that I think that this organizing among police across the country, and also corrections unions, which I talk a lot about in my book, actually put the cops and the jailers in an excellent position to assert themselves on a collective basis at a moment of great disorganization among the organized left, but also the organized labor movement in general, especially the public sector labor movement. So that in the mid-1970s in New York, when the city was cracking down on the expenses that had accrued under the Great Society expenditures and also the post-war New Deal that they passed in New York, called the New Deal for New York. When Wall Street was refusing to pay for these expenditures, organized labor throughout the public sector was in retreat and retrenchment, which they remain to this day, except for largely the police and the corrections unions, who were saying to the city, "You need us. We will do the work. You can cut all the parks employees you want. You can cut all the teachers you want. You need us, and we will run the city on a shoestring budget." And it was only because of the activism that they had done in the preceding decades that they were in a position to do so effectively.
Whew. Really excellent. I've been listening and taking so many notes. I hadn't thought about what I was going to say next, but I will just say thank you, Jarrod, because looking at those plants, well, that's really terrible information, right? I didn't know about that. So it's really nice to be soothed by the plants in your background. So I was really grateful to Donna, right, thinking about the longer term, right, to name Kelly Lytle Hernandez's work, right, and I often think about how Hernandez shows us that the first lockup, right, on indigenous land were Spanish colonial missions, right, where indigenous women, unmarried women and girls were locked up at night, so it was like very clear from the start that this was to impose a very specific settler colonial patriarchal order. But I'm also a 20th century US historian, and I think that carceral historians really have to reckon emotionally, politically, intellectually reckon with what seems like the very, sort of the grim and unceasing sameness of state violence. But it's really important too that we attend to the material changes that Donna and Jarrod have pointed out, right? This really profound and staggering expansion of the state capacity for violence and incarceration, particularly after World War II. So what I can add, right, to all the really excellent key moments that folks have named already, right, is that that liberal court, that Warren Court that Jarrod mentioned, right, really reflects this mid-century moment where there's a lot of contest over the scope of police power, right, where there's a lot of contest over the scope of police discretion. And that absolutely politicizes police in a way that I think we could argue is unprecedented, right? To engage in political work, to understand themselves of engaging in a political mobilization that's distinct from simply being, you know, the servants of capital, and specifically anti-Black capital, right, pre-World War II, where police are starting to see themselves as political actors in their own right. During this period of mid-century, you know, this really flourishing moment of mid-century debates over civil liberties and due process, right? And you know, from a gender sex perspective, those liberal debates were really important for the very real liberalization of sex laws that took place across the 20th century, right? You know, when unmarried women presumed to be engaging in straight non-marital sex, were not criminalized as they were routinely, right? And this is across the racial spectrum prior to World War II. So we really do see a meaningful shift in terms of sexual liberalization and acceptable sexual conduct, right? Presumed sexual conduct. And yet at the same time, we see this intensifying and systematic construction, right, of police apparatus, right, to control and punish folks who are supposed to be engaging in deviant sexual activity, right? And one example that I really think is important to ground, like, how do we understand both the liberalization of sex norms after World War II and the intensified and systematic action of police targeting predominantly you know, people of color in the US. And there's a moment that I talk about in my book in Atlanta, you know, which is really asking, you know, how do we get to a place of broken windows policing in Atlanta by the 1980s, right? This sort of liberal, Black-led city with, you know, the first Black mayor of a major Southern city, Maynard Jackson, elected in 1973. It might be my dates. I'm a historian, not a trivia pros. But, you know, so I think that there's a really important moment that's happening that we can see in Atlanta in particular, right? Where this mobilization, right, this political mobilization of police is happening at the same moment that capital is recognizing police as really important players, urban political players. The example that I want to offer, right, is Central Atlanta Progress Inc., this consortium of downtown business elites in Atlanta, long-running, multi-decade, pretty much started in the 40s, and they're still active and current today. They run two massive, sort of multi-million dollar reports. They fund these reports that are essentially policy recommendations that more or less get done, right? In the city, it's super powerful. There's one in 1973 and there's one in 1986, right? And the CAP report in 1973 is all about infrastructure. It's about public transportation. It's sort of about like the sort of material, what do we need for cities to effectively run, right? And it's about investment in public goods and services, right? By 1986, police, it is essentially a carceral document. It's all about expanding local carceral capacity, and police are seen as the ultimate like solution really to the problem of urban poverty. And, you know, they're very explicit in the 86 version, right, that, you know, that the social welfare programs of the 60s have been proven to be failures, even though, of course, that failure is itself, you know, a deliberate and dedicated project to overturn those programs and see them as failures. But the social welfare, the social redistribution of the 60s has been deemed a failure. And every other project needs to compete against and prove itself against the new gold standard of prisons and policing, right? And so for me, that's a really meaningful and powerful shift that we can see happening at the local level, right? Where police are becoming not just sort of the goons of capital, but are in fact, taking up more and more space at the urban table, right, as stakeholders and as providers, deliverers of what cities need, right, of the solution that cities need for profit, for so-called safety, right, for security, predominantly for middle class white homeowners in capital.
One comment I wanted to make in response to my two panelists is I was just thinking about what Jarrod outlined about the fiscal crisis in New York City in the 1970s and kind of this period of disorganization of the left, and also all the pressure that was put on the municipal unions during the fiscal crisis. And one thing that I'm struck by is, in addition to being an associate professor of history, I'm very involved in our union. I'm chapter president of New Brunswick, and have been involved in some of these dialogues about public sector unionism. And what I found is that the scale of organization among police and prison guards and all the different carceral state institutions, first of all, just their importance as a social force. There are over 1 million people inside the United States. In some ways, I feel like they are the shock troops of Trumpism and of what I would call racial fascism and right-wing force. But in having organizing conversations with people, trying to differentiate those unions from other public sector unions. And one of the ways that I often talk about them are as brotherhoods because of their historical formation. And to set it apart in many ways, I think that the inclusion of police and prison guards and these carceral border patrol agents, all these different carceral unions, has really been destructive to the larger union movement itself, because it often, the kinds of privileges that they enjoy are used as representative. Meanwhile, we see other public sector unions really going through this terrible period of retrenchment and loss of power. So I was just curious if you two have ideas about that. You, in particular, Jarrod, talking about your local story in New York. How do we separate these unions out from larger public sector unionism? Because I do think, and thinking about how our work applies today, this to me seems like one of the really important campaigns is to push them out of the AFL-CIO and other umbrella organizations.
Sure. I'll say very quickly. So I spent a number of years at the City University of New York, and I was a part of a large public sector faculty union. And I think that, unfortunately, at this late date in the American labor movement, unions are largely service organizations. They're benefits pools. They're the person you call when you screw up at work to get you out of trouble. And there's really not a lot of sense of actual class struggle or really of any kind of class understanding at all. I mean, and you like, if you watch like Harlan County, USA or whatever, like you wouldn't have had to explain to those miners that the cops had different interests than they did. But in these large municipal unions, and perhaps especially academic unions, where everything just becomes so hopelessly abstract, it's really easy to lose touch of the fact that you are in a class-based organization, and the cops have identified themselves time and again throughout history as the enemies of the working class and of working people and of any kind of organized force opposed to capital, besides them when they decide to take on the ruling class, right, with things like Trumpism. And so, I mean, I see it as a symptom of the broader decline of the political horizon of American unionism, and I think that the only real antidote is a reinvigoration of rank and file strategies, breaking the law early and often, pushing against the corporate model that has infected just about every American union, and just reinvigorating kind of the class struggle content at the heart of unionism. And I think once you do that, the way that the police respond to that, right, will leave no doubt in the minds of any of your comrades where the cops stand on the class line.
And
Go ahead, Donna. Yeah, no, go ahead.
I guess I would just say that I agree with that. Although I do think we're seeing a resurgence of unions. This may take us too far. I don't want us to stray from our discussion about police power in the carceral state. But I will say, looking at the radical teachers unions over the last 10 years, we're seeing a movement from especially women-led unions, whether it's flight attendants or teachers. The Chicago Teachers Union is an inspiration to us all. I also work at Rikers, where we have a real class-based, protect the most vulnerable. But yeah, I would also be interested to hear your thoughts, Anne, about gender in these brotherhoods, because I think the gendering piece is so deep and profound and is also a really central piece to the carceral infrastructure.
Yeah, and I really have to defer to y'all when it comes to police unions, not an area of my expertise. I know Stuart Schrader is doing a lot of really interesting work on how police unions were sort of the debates around police unions affiliation, right, with other sort of non-police units, and how they sort of like established themselves as these sort of distinct bargaining units. I guess what I would say about the relationship, though, between gender and policing and gender and police unions, right, is that another key difference, right, that we see across the latter half of the 20th century when it comes to policing is how the incorporation, I mean, and this is a long 20th century history, though, but the incorporation, right, of women into structures of policing is, very often spun as itself feminist, right? The very fact of having women as police officers, right, or as COs is itself, right, sort of recognized and justified and legitimized, right, as gender responsive policing or gender responsive incarceration, right? And so the inclusion then, right, of women within these units serves, I think, in really important ways to launder, right, the work that police or the violence that police enact, and to justify it as itself sort of a feminist form, a feminist response or a feminist arm, right, of the state. And that's something, right, that should absolutely be interrogated. But I'll just say, I know Stuart Schrader's doing a lot of good work on this. Mike Stotch is doing a lot of good work on this too. And one other person whose name is escaping me, you probably know, Dan.
Those are the two that came to mind. But I do think, in 2020, there was such a profound effort to get police unions out of the larger movement, out of the larger labor movement, sorry. And that was really a part of how the Black radicalism, like the labor vision of Black radicalism was so evident and on display. And I think it's part of why everything that's happened since has happened, right? That there were, I mean, Red May is based in Seattle, even if we're having this conversation virtually, and labor activists in Seattle did succeed in kicking the police union out of the local labor council. That was a big part of the defund movement, were these kind of labor fights in some pretty profound ways. And I think that's why you have mayors, governors, and presidential hopefuls running their campaigns in 2020 and beyond around funding the police, and why that's been such an intense part of the I mean, it's easy to call it a backlash. I think really Veshla Weaver's notion of a front lash is more more apt in this context, right? But the intensity of the response, and I'm going to use that as a hopefully not too brusque segue into my next question, right? Because we're talking a lot about these kind of major, liberal cities like New York, like Seattle, like Philadelphia. Anne's book, talks about Atlanta and Los Angeles and Boston. Donna looks at Ferguson and LA and Oakland, right? So I wanted to talk a little bit more. It's a two-part question, but maybe I'll ask them separately. So how should we understand the investment of the Democratic Party and different kinds of establishment liberal organizations or paragovernmental nonprofit organizations in the carceral state? I mean, this is something that each of your books looks at, and that I think really does help us understand these conversations about the labor movement, right? And the purpose and promise of the labor movement. The second part of the question that I'll ask in a minute is about the centrality of policing to the right, which we've talked a lot about, and is very plainly evident in the attacks on abortion and the attacks on trans people, and the attacks on indigenous sovereignty, just to name like several of the most pressing things that are happening just in the last couple of weeks. Right, where police power is such the fulcrum of the kind of patriarchal authoritarianism that we are in and heading more actively into. And yet there's something about the liberal city that is so invested in police authority. So why don't we start first, Jarrod, with you, and for all of you, just thinking about the liberal investment and what that is, and what's particularly liberal about these kind of democratic, big D democratic investments in the police.
So I can mainly speak not to the direct buildup of NYPD, but to the main topic of the Rikers book, which is the buildup of the New York City jail system and its carceral capacity to cage tens of thousands of people. The book begins in the mid-1950s with what was called at the time the New Deal for New York. This was an effort by actually the son of Robert Wagner, the architect of the National Labor Relations Act, to bring to New York a kind of recreation of the political coalition forged in the 1930s between a large public sector with relatively well-paid workers, well-funded institutions throughout official society, like hospitals, schools, and generally what we might call a Keynesian approach to creating a governing consensus, to break the inertia of the corrupt kind of post-Tammany Hall Democrats who were still holding on even as Tammany's star had fallen. And so the Captives begins with Wagner appointing to the Department of Correction a very fascinating character by the name of Anna Cross. Cross was a suffragist. She had been an early innovator of specialty courts like family court in New York City. Even by the standards of the 21st century, she would be considered a liberal judge. And in 1954, she took over the Department of Correction, operating explicitly under the banner of what we today call carceral humanism or penal welfareism, right? This idea that carceral facilities, jails, and prisons can be used to solve the social problems that wind up quarantined there, right? So Cross noticed that a lot of people in the jails were dealing with alcoholism, drug addiction, mental illness, and she decided, okay, well, given that these are, of course, individual pathological issues, right? We can use these human cages to cure these people of their ills and to send them back into society as, productive working class people who can be relied upon in their jobs and to raise families and so on and so forth, right? And you see here a clear lineage from the progressive era, right? The Cross was very much in that mold. And so the story that I tell in Captives is how the apex of post-war liberalism in New York actually created the infrastructure that served as the foundation for the Rikers Island as we know it today. Rikers was supposed to be a state-of-the-art, progressive, penological institution. It was supposed to, by this point in history, be the envy of correction departments all across the planet. And I won't go into all of the minutia of the plans that Cross had, and and how they came to be so different, right, in reality. But I will add just one very quick detail. Prior to the Anna Cross administration, Rikers was actually not connected to the land in New York. It was an island with no point of access that was convenient or easy. It was only accessible by ferry, and so it didn't make sense to cage a lot of people there. Cross was convinced that she could build a state-of-the-art, progressive, penological institution, much like the jails that they're trying to build to replace Rikers Island today. And Judah Shepp has written a lot about this in Progressive Punishment. So Cross actually built a bridge connecting Rikers to the mainland. And this piece of infrastructure, more than anything else in mid-20th century New York City history, enabled the hothouse expansion of Rikers Island as a large-scale facility for human caging to a degree that the city could not have possibly dreamed of before. And it actually culminated in one final anecdote. By 1968, the city worked with the Vera Institute to craft a plan for how they could incarcerate 10,000 New Yorkers in response to what we call a civil crisis, or whatever the nice word for insurrection, civil unrest. Yes, I forgot the euphemism. And so anyway, Vera worked with the city to plan how you could cage 10,000 New Yorkers with a day's notice. And by that point, Rikers Island was ground zero, right? So this was very much a product of post-war New York liberalism at its finest.
I think I'm next. I guess I have two answers, and one is just about kind of the facts of history, and the other is a broader point about ideology. And I think I'll start with the second one. So there's so many ways in which we deal with race as foundational to the United States. And I think it's impossible to talk about American liberalism. And I really do mean that in terms of the US as distinct from Europe or other parts of the world. And one of the core ideas, I think, it goes back to the very origins of the country about how universal citizenship is understood and how we understand the universal subject. And core to the American project has always been the defining of white citizenship and white settlers as normative versus a kind of pathological difference of others. And it just is, it's deep, deep, deep within our history. And it doesn't start in the 20th century, it goes back very far. But that tendency to understand others as pathological is just a core part of American history. And whether we're talking about the eugenics movement in the 19th century, there's a discussion about the immigration, first of the Irish and then of Central and Southern Europeans, and how they are understood as partially, how could I put this, as having the potential to be integrated into the American polis, but also as defined as other. And of course, indigenous people and peoples of African descent, and certainly Latinx populations of indigenous descent. That question of how race plays itself out with Latinx population is complex because it is also a large inclusive category. But understanding them as racial others is very important, because I think it's hard to talk about a punitive ethos in which we talk about the deserving and the undeserving. And I make that point just to start with American liberalism, because one thing that's really striking in the 20th century is that in order to justify expansion of rights, of privileges, of even social access, often discourses of pathology were used in order to create a coalition. So it's in this way, I think, a whole generation of us have been influenced by Elizabeth Hinton's work on the war on poverty, making an argument that the expansion of the war on poverty and the war on crime were inseparable from one another. But I think that this even predates that time period. It is the use of this idea of a population, talking about populations as pathological and as dangerous, and therefore in need of state redress. So a core part of American liberalism is not that we all come to we all enter the liberal polis on equal terms. So given the history of the United States with slavery, settler colonialism, Jim Crow, long histories of forced labor and extraction, that all citizens are not created equal. So I think that that ideological basis is really important. It's a core contradiction. And it's an important way to also understand the progressive era, both in the time period, the original time period, and then I'm going to also talk about Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton, because it's, of course, in the 1990s that they appropriate the term progressive because they want to move away from racial liberal. So I would say that we have a two-party system, Democrats and Republicans, winner take all, electoral college, limited forms of democracy. It's core to what the United States is. And the Democratic Party up through the 1960s is the party of white supremacy in the South. So it's this party that African Americans are incorporated into. So that contradiction of dealing with the Democratic Party in the North, which had been the economic liberal party, the party of immigrants, to some extent, problems of Tammany Hall, as Jarrod mentioned, but still a product of urban liberalism in the North, and then the product of white supremacy, one-party rule in the South. So African Americans are incorporated into this party with the successes of the American Civil Rights Movement, but of course the deep, deep racist ideology, not to mention the Dixiecrats that are still in Congress and have disproportionate power. So when we think about the war on poverty and the kind of liberalism of the 1960s, it has to deal with those contradictions of region and of racial ideology. So that said, the Democratic Party is supporting mandatory minimums in the 1950s. It is also the party of anti-crime. So it's not, although we often think of the kinds of Republican presidents from the genealogy, say from Richard Nixon through Ronald Reagan, through Trump. I mean, certainly George W. Bush should be included in that, but I think that is often the linkage that's made, that George W. Bush is associated, and George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. Well, certainly George H.W. Bush is also an important part of the history of the war on crime. You can't talk about the war on drugs in the book that I'm writing right now without talking about that. But the Democratic Party is just equally implicated in law and order politics. And I think it has to do with the histories of white supremacy in the North and in the South. And I would say that it is under Bill Clinton in the 1990s, and I have an essay in Assata Taught Me called When Black Lives Didn't Matter. And it's about the mobilization of a member of the Boston chapter of Black Lives Matter who confronted Hillary Clinton on the campaign trail to talk about her role with her husband that they played in anti-Black racism and law and order politics. One of the really charming things with the anecdote that I open up with is that the language that's used by the BLM member who interrupts Hillary on the campaign trail is she says, "I want you and your family to claim personal responsibility for what you have done with mass incarceration, what you've done against Black people as a whole." And what was wonderful about this is that she's appropriating the language of personal responsibility, which was used as a justification for stripping people of cash assistance, of saying that they don't have a right to any form of state support or assistance and that they too should be punished. So it was kind of the language of punishment. And so this young BLM member uses that against Hillary Clinton, that she wants her and her husband to take personal responsibility. But it was under a Democrat that we see the largest expansion in caging. So both at the state level and at the federal level, as well as the inclusion of so-called drug kingpins in the federal death penalty. And one of the ways that Bill Clinton is elected is that he flies back before the New Hampshire primary in order to oversee the state execution of Ricky Ray Rector, a Black man who was so impaired that he was saving his dessert for the day after his electrocution, and that he planned to vote for Bill Clinton in the fall. So whether we're talking about this foundational period that Jarrod was talking about that links to Rikers, you know, the kinds of vision of progressivism and the New Deal, which we know was inherently racially exclusionary. And don't get me wrong, the New Deal is very, very important for expanding social welfare. But like the Great Society, there are ways in which race has baked into social policy. So, you know, one of our really difficult problems that we have is that we have this very limited two-party system in which both political parties have historically been central to law and order politics. So it tells us that organizing outside the state is important, as well as, I would argue, as many people are saying today, outside, inside, and against the state, that all different kinds of organizing are needed to be part of a broad spectrum movement. But sadly, the Democratic Party is just as implicated in law and order politics as the Republican Party. And in the 1980s, you do have the Congressional Black Caucus co-sponsoring the Anti-Drug Abuse Act in 1986 and 1988 that enshrined the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine. So this is a long story in American history. We've focused on really the last 50 years, but it's a broader problem of American politics.
I'll just add a few more points because I know we're going to move to a commercial break in a second. But I just wanted to say, first, Peter Pihos is also working on Black police and unions, so definitely check out his brilliant work. So I think, you know, I just want to amplify what Donna and Jarrod have already been saying about these long and deep roots in liberalism, particularly going back to the progressive era when, and this was a very gender, right, and race, and what, by which I mean white specific project in the progressive era to develop a rehabilitative criminology, right, or a politics of rehabilitation and reform, right, where we have police women mobilizing, right, pushing for more power within local police departments by calling themselves social workers with guns, right, or social workers with police powers, right. So they're making that argument, you know, in the early 1900s. And, you know, they're seeing policing as a really powerful way to bend social welfare and social goods, right? To distribute social welfare and social goods, but necessarily through the punitive power and the punishing power of the carceral state, right? And you're seeing that happen, right, even before mass incarceration is really ramping up. So that's a really, I think, important origin for this very political, like bipartisan project, right? And I think it's also really important to amplify the ways in which this rehabilitative or preventive criminology was absolutely white supremacist, white specific, right? It's taking root within the context of Jim Crow segregation. While there were, you know, Cheryl Hicks talks about many Black reformers, right, who are engaging in the same argument in a distinct kind of politics, but very much trying to generate goods and resources, right, through these same arguments, but for Black women in particular. So it's definitely happening right across the color line, but very much rooted in this idea that the individual pathology is something for white folks, right? You know, they're treated as individuals. They're seen as in need of the rehabilitative supports of policing and punishment and prisons, right? Whereas Black women in particular are seen as, you know, reflecting larger group-wide pathologies, right? And not, you know, not capable, right, of that rehabilitation, that moral restoration that's really driving a lot of these early progressive projects. And so liberalism itself, right, and as we move forward, the New Deal itself is a way to, the New Deal itself also expanded the police powers of the FBI, right? So we always need to remember that this like massive expansion of social goods is happening at the same time that the FBI is being elevated as like a major national police force. Claire Potter talked about that in her first book. And I think liberalism itself, particularly in the post-war period, really depended on anti-Black containment. I talk about that in particular in a Boston case study where we see how sexual liberalism, spatial sexual liberalism, and the development of this sort of gentrified entertainment and retail downtown economy was necessarily predicated on banishing Black women and sexually profiled Black women from urban downtown streets, right? So I think that central contradiction that Donna is talking about was very explicit through policing. Like you can see it exposed through policing practices of what work policing is doing, and particularly in moments of peak liberalism, that work is designed to segregate, right, contain, right, and repress Black urban mobility. And I also just want to name, I think we're kind of getting there, but a lot of work that folks have been doing, including Max Felker-Canner, who Donna mentioned earlier, right, is the ways in which reform, right, liberal reforms actually expand police power. I mean, the main right way is that it's by reaffirming the authority of police, right, and affirming, right, this belief in the benevolent capacity of police to reform themselves. But I just want to name, right, the ways in which, I'll just pull one example, right, in the ways, particularly in the 1970s, right, where police departments are reeling from a crisis of legitimacy because after brutal shutdowns of Black uprisings, and there's a lot of work to incorporate, right, to include Black police into urban police departments. This is when we see some of the biggest numbers, right, the biggest increases in Black, right, in the integration or in the rise of Black numbers of officers in urban police departments in the 1970s. And yet, that in itself, sort of that move in itself encapsulates the ways in which those contradictions that Donna was talking about, because as more and more Black officers, in my case study, in this case is Boston, as more and more Black officers are brought into the BPD after 1968, right, they are being dispatched, right, to target presumptively Black crime, which means morals offenses, right, sex offenses, it means drugs. And so you have, right, and they're doing it, right, with these newly funded, these richly funded paramilitary programs, right? And so what you really see is both the incorporation, the inclusion of Black officers in order to engage, right, at the same time, wider and wider swaths of Black people in cities, right, to target them for these low-level misdemeanors. And so I think that's a really good example, right? A really good way to see in the ways in which reform actually expands and bloats the capacity of police to systematically target and to harass Black residents, Black urban residents, right? And the ways in which these liberal reforms, right, the inclusion and representation are actually expanding harm and doing a very clear anti-Black political work.
Thank you so much. I, as promised, do have a part 2 to that question, but before I ask it, I wanted to turn the mic over to Philip for a Red May announcement.
Well, thanks very much, Dan. I hate to interrupt this very important conversation, which is considering policing from angles that many panelists that we haven't. That is, the police as an institution in a democratic government, what their role can be, if any. And I think I would like to just do my quick pitch for Red May, and then lurk in the background of this conversation. I have a few questions of my own to throw in after we get the ones from the audience. Please take this moment while I'm doing my pitch to formulate a question and leave it in the comments. It will come to Dan directly, and he will read your question out loud and give it to everyone to answer. We have some great events coming up in the next week. On Thursday at 11 a.m., Karl Marx, Historian of Social Times and Spaces, by George Garcia. It's a book by George Garcia Quesada, which actually reformulates Marx's theory of history, which has been thrown in the dustbin of history as a kind of a bit of 19th century stagist determinism, but considers Marx's writings on history in the light of how they were written under what circumstances. Were they ripped out for a newspaper in one night? Were they something that he worked on for 3 or 4 months? What weight should we give to each part of Marx's statements about history rather than cherry picking them? It's a very interesting discussion. We have Massimiliano Tomba and the hosts of the podcast Real Abstractions, Cordelia Belton and Edouard. That's on the 12th of May, Thursday at 11 a.m. On the 13th of May, also at 11 a.m., Revolution After Such Shipwrecks. Enzo Traverso has a book from Verso, that rhymes, Enzo Traverso Verso, on the intellectual histories of revolution. Rebecca Carl, Alberto Toscano, and AJ Singh Chowdhury will be the discussants in that panel. On the 14th, also at 11 a.m., that's a Saturday, Remapping the Race Class Problematic, with Sarika Chandra, Chris Chen, and Chino Mayday as the moderator. You can read a version of what they'll talk about in a new anthology called Totality Inside Out, which I highly recommend, which has people like Chris Chen, Joshua Clover, Sarah Briette, and others writing about totality. It's edited by the late Kevin Floyd, whose absence we really miss, a really brilliant left thinker. On the 14th, the same day, at 3 p.m., The Global Afterlives of Slavery with Yogita Goyal and Paul Nadal. Yogita has a book called Running Genres about the revival of the slave narrative as an analogical explanation of everything from migration to sexual slavery to so forth. How does that fit? How does it work and so forth? Or does it work? And on the 15th, at 11 a.m., Walter Benjamin's Message in a Bottle, discussion of his theses on the concept of history, the last thing he wrote, with Joanna Goss, Esther Leslie, Daniel Morenza, and Meike Schmidt-Gleam, all the way from Germany. Should be very interesting. Now, how do we bring all this to you? Well, it's been fairly easy doing the online versions. We don't have the airfares that we do when we mount a full-scale Red May, as we plan to do next year. We will need a great deal more money to put it on than we have to put this on. And so we depend on the kindness of strangers. We have a GoFundMe, Fan the Flames of Red May, which is on our website. And you can give that, or you can also give to our Patreon, which is there. So that's it. Please be generous, and we hope to be around for many years, voyaging around the Marxist universe. And anyway, we will now get back to considering policing as an institution. I'll lurk in the background here. I have a few questions, but take the ones from the people from the floor first.
Great, thanks so much, Philip, and just really appreciate Red May creating space for these kinds of conversations. So I'm not seeing any from the floor quite yet for our that relates specifically to what we're doing. So some unrelated comments coming through, but I wanted to maybe just fuse that question that I teased about, dealing with just a deeply entrenched racist, heteropatriarchal authoritarianism that very openly represents a minority position, right? But it is very explicitly and joyfully relying on police power, right? So the abortion bans, the attacks on trans people and their families are all premised on, you know, vigilante policing, the formal institution of policing, and under threat of incarceration. And so I guess I wanted to hear each of you, you know, your books draw on such profound genealogies and lineages of struggle, from the Black Panther Party, the Combahee River Collective, Wages for Housework, the Young Lords, to a series of others, right? So I'm thinking about this, you know, kind of terrifying moment that we are in, that only promises to be more terrifying, and certainly in the short term. And curious to hear each of you reflect on what these histories offer, what these histories of struggle that your books record offer us for, as Donna, you put it, that kind of outside, inside, and against the state kind of response in this moment. And I forgot, Jarrod went first last time. Anne, let's start with you.
So I think there's so much, it's hard to go first. So it's nice to build off of what folks are saying. So I think what I want to really focus on is what I learned from studying feminist activists in the era of broken windows policing, right? So how feminists, particularly anti-capitalist, socialist, multiracial feminists and Wages for Housework, Black feminists like Barbara Smith and the Combahee River Collective, as well as Margaret Prescott, who was affiliated with Wages for Housework, but started a coalition in Los Angeles called Black Coalition Fighting Back Serial Murders. And I want to just name what I learned from those activists in particular. And what they taught me. I love, you know, that Donna's new collection, right, is Assata Taught Me, because I am so indebted to the feminists that I studied for in my book, right, and the lessons that they teach us and continue to teach us. So, you know, I think the form of state violence that these activists in the late 1970s and 80s, these feminists were confronting, was the simultaneous state violence and violent action, right, and violent neglect, right, and the ways that these are proliferating and manifesting in women's lives, and particularly Black women's. Those most vulnerable to policing were also most vulnerable to police neglect, right? And this is not to say, right, this is not an over-policing, under-policing model, which would suggest, right, that there is an appropriate level of policing, right? But this is rather that police are structuring, right, and this goes back to Prohibition era segregation, right? When police are actively restricting so-called vice to Black neighborhoods, right? In that same moment, right? Even as Black people are disproportionately targeted for morals offenses, and this will be like gambling for men, but sex, you know, sex laws for Black women, right? Even as they're disproportionately targeted, their neighborhoods are being subject to police neglect, right? The police are allowing you know, vice industries to flourish in Black neighborhoods, and yet when, in one case that I name in my book, right, when, for example, Black women's homes are being invaded by white men allegedly in search of a house of prostitution, and when Black women fight back against these invasions, these non-state invasions, and police finally do arrive on the scene, it's the Black woman, right? It's, in this case, Eve Bolden in Pittsburgh in the early 1930s, right? She's the one who's charged with assault by police, right, for defending herself against these white men who have invaded her home, justifying it through police-sanctioned vice economies in her neighborhood, right? So it's by the 1970s, the really triggering violence for the feminists that I look at in my book, the anti-violence feminists that I'm looking at, the triggering events is a reign of terror of serial murders targeting Black women who are profiled as sex workers or profiled as street people, right? And Margaret Prescott, Barbara Smith, and other Black feminists and wages for housework feminists are very clear, right? That it's the same targeting of Black women as presumed sex workers, the same ways in which policing creates social meanings of Black women as deviant, right, as degraded, as less worthy to take up space on city streets. It's that same policing that renders women vulnerable to non-state violence as well, right? And so state violence actually proliferates non-state forms of violence against Black women. And so I think that that's a really important analysis, right, that we get from these feminists in the 1970s. They're very, very clear, connecting the dots, and not just with content warning, right, but they name it very clearly. A Wages for Housework activist names it very clearly, and Black Women for Wages for Housework name it very clearly, and that's Margaret Prescott's work as well, right? It's always open season on Black prostitutes. Police hunt down hookers, and that gives the green light, right, that all other men can do the same, right? So it's really, so, you know, apologies for that language, but they're very clear and very explicit about the relationship between state violence and non-state violence against vulnerable women. Those same activists like Margaret Prescott were recognizing, right, during the 1980s, and in this case, it's in Los Angeles in particular, right, as, you know, as Mayor Bradley's administration is bending to hotly politicized demands for increased police budgets, Margaret Prescott and others in Los Angeles are recognizing that this is a clear draining of social welfare resources, you know, away from, it's a redistribution, right, of state resources away from education, away from healthcare, away from social supports, and toward policing and jails and prisons, right? So she's very clear about what this redistribution means. And she is an early visionary, right, of what defund became, right? So I think that, but she's also very clear that that we need to start, right, with those who are most vulnerable to these proliferating forms of state and non-state violence. She's very clear that that's where we need to start in order to redistribute those resources back, right, to poor women of color, you know, and to reinvest, right, divest from state violence. And in order to make women safer, right, it's about supporting social resources, healthcare, education, housing, cash assistance. So that's what I have.
I think that the question is about how we looked essentially to the archive of the past of previous activists. Well, as mentioned, my book is called Assata Taught Me. So it's a collection of essays largely written between 2014, no, somewhere between maybe 2013 through about 2016. And they're written with a real spirit of delight and seeing the takeoff of what's become known as the movement for Black Lives. After having studied these kinds of issues for a long time, and especially when writing about and researching the drug war and the war on gangs in Los Angeles in the 80s and 90s, we had wonderful radical activism, but there was a real challenge in terms of translating that into mass organizing. So I think the Panthers, I started the book with an essay that predated Living for the City, which was really a story of genesis of a new kind of radical politics and creation of the Panthers, both out of a spirit of the kind of migration from the South to American cities, and to remind us of, even in the face of such overwhelming repression, because I think when we talk about the United States, and this is important, the scale of repression of the United States is enormous. US is the great anti-communist hegemon. And I find myself saying this a lot because I think there's a generational approach to politics that's different for people who became politically active and politicized after the Cold War. But, you know, the Panthers are always a reminder of how teenagers and people in their early 20s, recent migrants from the South, who in so many ways had been marginalized and denied support, created a membership-based mass organization and took on the police the police. So I think it's important to look back to that. The book stretches from the Panthers to the movement for Black Lives, and the final essay is about the genesis of the movement for Black Lives. As you can hear in my voice, I feel quite somber right now because of the enormity of what we're facing. And I think it's important to look to the archive of past struggle, but also always to recognize the challenges of the present. And we're in just a very dangerous moment in American history. I just have to say that. It's not as easy for me to talk about it as a moment of continuity, because I think that the gains that were won, especially in post-war organizing by the Panthers, the Civil Rights Movement, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, a whole series of radical organizations, those gains have proved very tenuous. And I think we need to draw from the archive of past struggle. But I think one of the things that's most needed right now are real member-based organizations, base building, and looking back to how different movements have been able to do mass mobilizing, because I think that that's what we really need. We need a politics of protest, but we need even more so a politics of organization. So I think I would look to, and I explicitly talk about the Panthers, I would also look to the radical union movement. I would look to the grassroots organizing of the civil rights movement, of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Combahee River Collective. I also think the history of tenant activism is extremely important, the crisis in housing right now. I think that one of the challenges I see right now, as abolition has become the primary framework in many ways of the left, is to figure out how we root that in process and in member-based organizations. So I think the anti-capitalist piece is extremely important. And one thing that I've learned involved in organizing is that it requires always specific organizing around material issues. And so bringing together the opposition to police and the carceral state, but linking that directly to tenants' rights, to rent control, to protecting the right to organize, to, defining gig workers as workers, not as subcontractors. So I think that I do draw a lot of hope from Assata, and my argument is that one of the reasons that Assata has become a defining icon of the movement is not just that she was a Black Panther, a New York Black Panther and a member of the Black Liberation Army, but it's also because she was broken out of prison and became a fugitive in Cuba. So she in some ways is the instantiation that the impossible is possible. So I think we need those, we need freedom dreams and visionary politics. But I think that we really need to go back to organizing. I think it's really important. I think the politics of protest is not enough. And it's been very painful to witness the amazing mass mobilization that we saw in 2020 with up to 26 million people going out on the street, but figuring out how to translate that into organized gains. And I will say, I think that one of the things that's needed is making coalitions with people that we may not like. I actually think that we really do need to do that. And the Panther Party, they didn't make coalitions with people they didn't like. They made coalitions with people they did like. But I think that we need coalition. And I draw still a lot of insight from Bernice Regan Johnson and that anthology that came out in the 1980s, Homegirls, where she talks about the difference between home and coalition. And given what we are facing, which is a real kind of patriarchal Christian militarism that is trying to roll back many of the gains of the 20th century, I think that we need to figure out how to cultivate and nurture those spaces of home organization, but also coalition, because the fight for public infrastructure, I think, is very important. And despite all the problems that we've talked about with liberalism, there are also scenarios that we can imagine that are worse than liberalism. And I do think that we're facing them right now. So I guess I'll stop there. I draw a lot of hope from the Black radical tradition. I also do think we're kind of, I would say for me personally, in the biggest moment of political crisis that I've seen. And I'm quite worried. I'll stop there before I go to even darker places.
Are we at time? I didn't know how.
I think technically,
Yeah,
but
basically we can run anywhere between from 4:30 to 5. We can stop as soon as the discussion lulls, if you feel. You're at time when we feel we're at time.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question for Jarrod, starting from both something that Jarrod said and then also something that Donna said. It's a kind of police-focused question. I'm kind of fascinated with your focus on the police as an institution that grows up during the 1973 New York crisis and develops its own institutional ends that are not obvious to people who don't play inside baseball, but in fact are even more dangerous when one would think about it. I mean, we see the police through iPhone videos, which are the acts of individual policemen, but we don't understand what the threat to democratic government, much less communism, is the institution of the police that grows up in and of itself. It's kind of like one of those free mercenary companies in Renaissance Italy that roamed around, or the Freikorps in Germany. It literally serves at this point only itself. It doesn't work with anybody else in the city government. It does what it wants to at the level, and the union is the element of that. So my question would be something like this. When we use a slogan like defund the police, people are thinking, wait a second, nobody's going to protect me on the street or so forth. How do we make clear that what we're talking about is that there suddenly has grown up within all the city governments an institution that is totally for itself, that doesn't works with city government only if it wants to, rather than seeing itself as the servant of the city and the people in the city. This is of absolute no use to us, and we have to literally get rid of the institution and create some other one that's a genuine public institution, because this is not. But how do we make that clear that we're not abandoning people to their safety on an elementary level is being left alone? We're dealing with a threat to democracy.
I think that was a question for me specifically, but I'll say a few words, and then I think everybody else probably has some interesting things to say about it as well. I think both Donna and Anne have touched on important historical precedents, specifically within the history of Black organizing in the United States, in which organizers who were targeted by the police and who were organizing in communities that were targeted by the police were simultaneously grappling with the neglect and abandonment of their communities by anything approaching a security organization. And I think there's a really interesting history outlined by Beth Ritchie in the fantastic book Arrested Justice about how a large strain of contemporary abolitionism arose from the movement against interpersonal violence, specifically within working class Black communities. And these activists quickly came to the conclusion that, number one, the police weren't doing anything to help women in abusive situations. And number two, in the rare cases when they did, police, court, state intervention only made things worse. And so I teach in a criminal justice department in Chicago Southlands. It's a working class, majority minority institution, and many of my students come from communities that have been ravaged by deindustrialization, on top of the segregation and structural abandonment that had already existed there. And so when we talk about abolition, it is a very concrete discussion. And so I think it needs to begin with the premise that people do terrible things to each other in the world. Crime is not a discourse. Crime is, I mean, in a lot of ways, it can be discursive, right? And we know that it can be weaponized, so on and so forth. But there is an untold amount of horrible antisocial violent acts committed between some of the most powerless people in our society on a day-to-day basis. It is not a right-wing myth, right? We live in a very antisocial society. So that's the first premise. The second premise is the investment of police, the saturation of our society, of every institution of our society by cops, courts, and prisons has not made this any better, right? Or else where I live on the south side of Chicago would be the safest place, you know, in the city, because, you know, you have the most people locked up, right? And of course, we know that that's not true. So it becomes a matter of really meeting people where they are in the primary concerns of their life, which is that most people just want to go from point A to point B throughout their day-to-day life without being the victim of some kind of antisocial act. And I think that there's too much of the left in the United States by virtue of being located in these pockets of relative privilege that surround universities and middle-class communities that turns up its nose at the idea that millions of Americans actually inhabit social worlds that are defined by crime and antisocial behavior on a day-to-day basis. And it's something that you have to take deathly seriously if you plan on ever getting across any kind of liberatory message in a working-class community.
I have another question on Donna's statement that we haven't, or point that we haven't seen democracy in America except after the Voting Rights Act. I think that's a perceptive point that if you look at the archive, for example, in Chile, a long time it was referred to as the most democratic country in Latin America because it had elections, blah, blah, blah. It was only since 1958 that almost everybody could participate. But my question is this: at the point, since it's so recent, at the point where democracy becomes nearly a reality, the kind of turmoil that results around it, from everything from fascist coups to institutional resistance to so forth, is extreme. And I mean, I guess what Donna is saying to us is that old Betty Davis line, fasten your seatbelt, it's going to be a bumpy ride. But everybody who's been on Red May this year feels it at this moment. I mean, yesterday, Jody Dean and Doc Hammond said, I'm feeling gloomy and so forth. But I think everybody is realizing that this is not, the liberals don't get yet how extreme this struggle is going to be and how far the people will go who are pushing it. You know, all they can do is express wonder that they're not obeying the law or that they transgress the law, or that these things happen in our time, as Walter Benjamin says, and that we're trying to get ready for an era that's going to involve struggle of new kinds. And we're not exactly sure, I think, how to prepare, right?
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, we're in very big trouble, and we're seeing the potential dismantling of as limited as American democracy has been, but we are in danger of seeing even this limited form of democracy being dismantled. And I think it's really important to take that seriously. And I can't believe I'm going to say this at Red May, but I'm going to say it because I believe it, which is that I actually think that we have to figure out how to organize with people we don't like, and that includes organizing with liberals, period. Like, I'm a member of a labor union, and it's been very useful for me for figuring out what organizing conversations look like. That the most important thing of doing political organizing is not only to talk to the people you agree with, because often you don't even have to talk to the people you agree with, you know? And I think that having these difficult conversations, what Jarrod referenced, you know, I came from a very working class post-industrial city in Western Pennsylvania, and it shapes how I see everything. And I think that we have to talk to people that we may not agree with, our own family members who may be big supporters of the police. And this is not only white working class people, this can also be Black working class people. We have to have uncomfortable conversations with people. And then we have to find these points of unity. Because to me, one of the big points of unity is fighting for basic commons, basic public infrastructure. We are, as we're seeing this, really, I think it's a racial fascist minority rule vision of politics that's here and it's coming. And they are going through the legal apparatus. And that really, really matters. So I think that, you know, we're in a kind of moment of crisis where we have to have our time horizon for the kinds of, we have to always have a politics that is larger than the politics of the moment and have our longer term goals, but we also have to have shorter term goals. And I think fighting around basic rights and voting rights and the protection of voting rights, very important. And, you know, one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is that it's actually my way of giving myself hope. And even though it sounds very dark, it actually works for me, as I've been thinking a lot about Latin America, thinking about Chile, but also about like Argentina and Brazil, countries that have large non-white populations. And that kind of settler colonial history has shaped the nature of how politics has evolved, especially the politics of democracy. And going through periods of authoritarian rule and then coming back and having a contestation with the left. And I think it's possible that this is the direction that the United States is moving in because of American exceptionalism. And I fall into this as well. It's like the idea that if our democracy is somehow broken, then it's just broken, and what will we do? But the truth is, most countries in the world have dealt with these impulses of authoritarianism, a loss of democracy, and our democracy is such a recent one. So I've just been thinking about that we can draw some hope by looking at other countries. But I think that fascism is a real possibility in the United States. It's always been part of our history, and I'm not naming it as something that's just emerged out of nowhere. In Black Reconstruction, Du Bois talks about the attack on democracy in the South as a force of fascism, of redemption. And this, of course, predates Europe in the interwar years. And we know that Hitler looked to the United States and its system of racial classifications also as a way to think about and craft National Socialism. But yeah, I guess that's what I would say. I think liberal democracy is in trouble, and we have to find common cause to create broad Popular Front coalitions. And I think Popular Front will have to include a portion of liberals. So
it's the anti-fascist moment.
It's the anti-fascist moment. I do think so. But that doesn't mean that we give up our larger fight.
No, not at all.
For abolition and to eliminate the carceral state and to figure out these concrete alternatives and have really rooted and grounded anti-capitalist struggle. I think I would like to see more talk about that. I think because there's a lot of kind of rhetoric about anti-capitalism, but how do we translate that into specific parts of our movement? And I don't know how to do that without organizing around jobs, education, and housing, core material needs of people.
Well, something to work on. I guess we can all take it back to our little core of people and discuss how we can somehow acquire a large enough army to resist the army that is well organized, much better organized than the left, unfortunately, at the moment. But it's a lot of work to do, but it can inspire us, right? Yes, of course. Shall we end that?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much more to say. I wish we could keep this panel going to the outdoor bar or gathering where we could keep that.
Yeah, if live we would love to a bar.
Popular fun. I think probably we can do in our. I want to thank all of our panelists for just such a rich and robust conversation, and encourage everyone who's watching to please pick up Assata Taught Me, Captives and the Streets Belong to Us, as well as, before or after you make your donation to the Red May Patreon, you can go to Bookshop or the respective publisher homepage to buy your books. And yeah, thank you all so